Welcome back to Filling in the History. I am the amateur historian, and we are going to be traveling through the Joseph Smith papers yet again, talking about early Latter-day Saint and early American history. Um, what we're going to be doing is kind of a turning point here where I'm going to be kind of showing you where we are in the papers. We're almost done. There are 15 volumes of the document series. We are on volume 11, and that means that as we go along, I'm going to kind of be letting you know when you have endured yet another volume of the Joseph Smith Papers project. So today we're going to be talking about sections 129 through 132. And if it's not been obvious, this podcast will not go on forever. Once we're done with the Joseph Smith Papers, this episode series will come to an end. And this is one of those ends. 132, section 132 of the Doctrine and Covenants as we have it today, is the last canonized revelation of Joseph Smith. And so we do have a couple of unpublished revelations that come after this, but this is the last one that we have canonized. After this, I'm going to be starting the episodes with previously recorded, like sections 133, 134, were actually given in the 1830s. So we're going to be going back in time just because that's how the church compiled their scriptures here. And so, yeah, we're coming to the end of the revelatory life of Joseph Smith. And as we come to the end of this, we're going to be coming down to the fact that Joseph has about 1 year left on this earth before he's shot and killed in a prison. So we shall start part 1 today with section 129, and a lot about Joseph Smith finally coming home. So when we last left our heroes, 1843 covers the most documents of any year in the Joseph Smith Papers at 635, according to the Joseph Smith Papers website. We will cover almost half of those today, but we will be covering 4 sections of the Doctrine and Covenants as well as we have it. So that's 129, 30, 31, and 32. 132 is a massive section. It also contains the largest verse in our modern scriptures. It's 132, verse 19. Very, very long. A lot of legalistic language, and it has to do with eternal marriage, celestial marriage, getting married in the temple, being sealed, whatever you want to call that. That's why that verse is so long. And it goes over, and this is where things are going to get tense, it goes over plural marriage. And for those of you who may not be members of the church, this is usually the defining feat for most people when they think about Mormons or Latter-day Saints or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They think everyone's got a bunch of subservient women just having children and stuff. And I'm hoping by the end of this that you can see that our definitions of things and their definitions of things and the current definition of things are usually far away from some of the nasty stuff that can come around polygamy. We're also going to be talking about skipping over just a ton of stuff. I'm going to be hopefully just being very upfront about the fact that I can't go through every minutes of every meeting or every conference. We get excerpts from the times and seasons. We just don't have time for that. Otherwise, this episode would be like 4 hours long. So can't be doing that. And 132, just as a fair warning, gets its own part today. It's a very long section. Anyway, so enough for the preamble. Let's start in with John C. Bennett starts making claims against the church, and he's trying to incite people against the church. Was basically the most biggest topic of all of the letters in the fall of 1832. Sorry, 1842. There is also talk of a Nauvoo temple construction, and we need to get some materials for that. We get a few items from the British immigration project that they've been doing. So a lot of, we have apostles that are set up in England, and there's a ton of people from the British Isles that are coming over to the United States. And we get some theft. There is a major fire on the Liverpool docks around this time, which sets things back for the immigration project. And it also fires back then, the Liverpool fire in England in 1842, or maybe it's 1843, I forget, or 1842. It took 5 days to put it out. So count your blessings that we have fire brigades today that we didn't have back then. I'm using the British term. Anyway, we get an interesting letter here from Lorenzo Snow, who was presiding over conferences in England, and he shares this. Many of the nobility have been privileged to listen to the proclamation of life and receive a faithful warning of those coming scenes of calamity and distress they shall shortly experience. The 2 books of Mormon ornamentally bound and suitably prepared by Elder B. Young, as presents to Her Majesty and His Royal Highness, left with me by Elder L. Richards, or Levi Richards, I have had the pleasure of delivering to Her Majesty and His Royal Highness Prince Albert, through the politeness of Sir Henry Wheatley. We pray their eyes may be opened so that they may comprehend their contents. What are we talking about here? Well, Brigham Young gave them this book. Here's a picture of this book. This is an ornate Book of Mormon presented to Queen Victoria from Brigham Young officially, but actually handed physically by Lorenzo Snow to Sir Henry Wheatley of sort of the royal court, and it was presented to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth and Prince Albert. Now, what's really interesting about this, the photo you're looking at is actually found in the Royal Collection Trust for the British royal family. So it is held to this day by the British royal family. So this is not something that the church kept. This was actually delivered to Queen Victoria, which I find really fun. And if you want, you can go to eBay and buy a replica of this if you feel so inclined. So there you go. All right, moving on. We get a few things about the Nauvoo Temple coming along with satisfaction. We get business letters. We get a poem from Eliza Snow trying to comfort Joseph in hiding and letting him know that Emma was all right and being cared for by his friends. Then we get a letter published in the Sangamo Journal, which is the paper in Springfield, Illinois, to George W. Robinson, who is Sidney Rigdon's son-in-law, who had left the church. Part of that disaffection could have been from the fact that Joseph Smith was taking Nancy Rigdon as a plural wife. So this letter states thusly: Mr. George W. Robinson, Sir, I take this opportunity to give you a few items of my faith respecting yourself. I believe you are a consummate scoundrel, and that you embezzle my letters and steal my money that is sent to me by way of the post office, and that you are in cahoot with others in it. And I believe you are joined with thieves and robbers, and are privately trying to do me all the injury you can with some others, which I shall not name now. And I give you this timely notice that I shall take every means to bring you to justice openly and boldly and publicly, etc. Signed, Joseph Smith. P.S. I believe you are a whoremonger also, while you are crying out against others. Unquote. So I love 19th century insults. They're just my favorite pastime. Not very nice here. George receives this letter, fires back demanding proof of these accusations, and generally not appreciating the tone of a publicly published letter, by the way. This is actually published in the newspaper, as you've seen. And that is also found in the Sangamo Journal. So they're kind of communicating through a publication. And really, there is no difference, by the way, between that and having some fight online through Facebook or X or whatever you want to use, right? So it's very fascinating that we really haven't changed that much. So anyway, we get a few more letters, which are letting Joseph and the church know how the members and missionaries are combating false claims. This is John Bennett and some others. We get a notice in the paper that John Taylor is taking over the Times and Seasons editorial duties because Joseph is just too busy now. We get a full document handing over the press and everything in it to John a few days later. There's a lot about accusations brought against Thomas Hunter and Amos Davis for speaking against leaders in Nauvoo, but we will basically skip that for this episode. We get all the way to December, and Thomas Ford, this is the new governor of Illinois, is writing and is asking, just like his predecessor, for Joseph Smith to submit to arrest, which Justin Butterfield, the United States Attorney for Illinois, suggests that he obey. Esquire Justin over there is also dealing with Joseph and Hiram's bankruptcy stuff, so he was somewhat familiar with their situation. In response to this, Joseph tried to get another writ of habeas corpus and asked the governor for a new warrant so that he could avoid extradition to Missouri. And what you're going to see from here on out is this nonstop refrain back and forth between Thomas Ford and Joseph Smith saying, like, dude, come in. And he says, oh, you didn't write your paperwork right, or this was misspelled, and just doing everything he can to avoid going to Missouri. And as we will see, once they do prevail on it, they do kill him. Like, that is, like, of course they're going to kill him. They've been trying to kill him ever since he moved in. So anyway, it does end not well for Joseph and Hiram Smith. We do get a copyright for the map of the city of Nauvoo, which is cool. You may have actually seen this map here and there before, but there's a copyright for this map, city of Nauvoo. We got a ton more paperwork, which is skipped, but that is the end of 1842. And so now we get into 1843. We get an invitation to a party at Wilson and Elizabeth Law's home on the 11th of January, 1843. This was to be a celebration of yet another legal victory for Joseph, which allowed him to go home to Nauvoo. It's not the prettiest card. It's not the nicest invitation we've ever seen, but it is an invitation nevertheless. So, anyway, so Joseph finally gets to come home. He's been sort of on the run, on the lam, as we say. And then we get what I was actually very touched by this when I first read it. It's a very tough story of Mary Connor. So here's the story. We get a letter from a woman by the name of Caroline Adams around the 15th of January, 1843. Now, the historical introduction to this is long, but the writers from the Joseph Smith papers, I think, did a really fantastic job of telling the story. So in honor of that, I'm just going to read what they say. So bear with me. On the 15th of January, 1843, Caroline Young's Adams mailed a letter from New York City to Joseph Smith in Nauvoo, Illinois, informing him of her suspicion that her husband, George J. Adams, was guilty of adultery. Caroline likely joined the church in New York City in February of 1840, around the same time as her husband. In the intervening years, George spent most of his time as a missionary in England and Boston, leaving Caroline alone for long periods of time. In summer and fall 1842, George left the eastern United States for a lengthy stay in and around Nauvoo, where he met and visited with Joseph Smith. During one of those interviews, Joseph Smith apparently confronted him with accusations of adultery, and he subsequently confessed to the charge. It is unclear when Adams left Nauvoo, but he apparently arrived back in New York City by January of 1843. Because the affair apparently took place while he was a missionary in England, George J. Adams was likely not aware that Mary Connor, the 23-year-old daughter of Henry Connor, an early convert in London, was pregnant with their child. In early January 1843, Mary Connor arrived at the Adams home with an infant, whom she identified as Adams' son. Connor's arrival with the child shocked Caroline Adams, who had no prior knowledge of her husband's infidelity. George denied the child was his, and soon thereafter left New York City to preach in Boston. In his absence, Caroline apparently took responsibility for the care of her husband's child, and possibly for Connor as well. According to her letter to Joseph Smith, Caroline contemplated adopting the child in order to quiet rumors of the affair. Later documents suggest she followed through on this plan, naming him George Oscar and raising him as her own. About 2 weeks after learning of the child, Caroline Young's Adams wrote this letter to Joseph Smith to inform him of the situation and ask him to use his prophetic gift to discern whether her husband was guilty of adultery. She requested that if Joseph Smith determined that her husband was guilty, Joseph Smith quietly call him to Nauvoo to deal with the transgression privately. Adams was so concerned with privacy that she addressed the letter to Emma Smith, believing that sending the letter to her would lessen the chances of others seizing or reading it. Moreover, she requested that Joseph Smith not let anyone else read it. Joseph Smith appears to have received the letter by the 10th of February, 1843, when he instructed the quorum of the 12 apostles to silence George J. Adams and have him return to Nauvoo. It is unclear whether Joseph Smith responded to Caroline. At some point after Joseph Smith received the letter, its first 4 pages were separated from the remainder of the document, and they are no longer extant. Very sad. And I have to say, Caroline, wherever you may be, what an amazing woman you are to take care of this young woman and this child to the point of adopting the child. And also the nerve of this guy to do what he did, deny what he did, and then go on another mission. Anyway, he eventually did confess. But kind of a sad situation. This is the kind of stuff that Joseph Smith dealt with as a president of a church. And then we see some other things that happen that he has to deal with as the mayor of Nauvoo. So a lot of weight there on this man, as well as on these people who had to deal with all of this. But yeah, this 23-year-old young woman made her way all the way to New York and wound up at his doorstep. And yeah, so quite a remarkable story. So we're getting back to legal issues again, trying to get Joseph extradited. I'm going to skip back to our little party at the Law's house. Joseph commissioned something called Jubilee Songs, which he had printed and handed out at this party. After this is a poem from W. W. Phelps called Vade Mecum, or Go With Me. We're not sure if this was for the return of Joseph, but it seems to fit. Anyway, that is found in the Times and Seasons. So you get these like, let's sing these songs. I've got some songs that I want to sing. And W. W. Phelps gets into it as well. We get a really wacky situation where John C. Bennett and Orson Pratt's wife, Sarah, accused Joseph Smith of proposing marriage to her. Now, Joseph Smith and others accused John C. Bennett and Sarah Pratt of having an extramarital affair. So here we go again. Orson Pratt becomes so distraught by all of this that he actually goes missing for a while. And it sounds like could have been contemplating taking his own life just because he was like, is the prophet lying to me? And is he trying to be sealed to my wife without me knowing? Did my wife have an affair with John Bennett? Like, and it really affected him. And he was an apostle at the time. Anyway, the contemplating, taking his life and missing, it sounds like hearsay from the histories, but it is part of the history, so I will say it. Anyway, Orson Pratt is actually removed from his apostleship, and Amasa Lyman is put in his place. Now, there's a lot going on here, but everybody got it sorted out, and this meeting on January 20th that we see the minutes for explains that the 12 did not have a full quorum. So this is they kind of used technicalities here. Once things got sorted out and we kind of find out that Joseph didn't really do the thing and all this kind of stuff, they said, well, actually, sorry, guys, you didn't have a full quorum when you made the decision. So, Orson, come on back. You're reinstated. And and Orson and Sarah Pratt, whether she had an affair or whatever, they stayed together to the tune of both of them passing away in Utah. And they served missions together, even though Sarah was quoted as saying that she hadn't believed in the church for 30 years or so. So basically, from the time of this trial to then, she was like, I don't really believe in this anymore. But she was married to an apostle, and they served missions, and they did stuff. And like I said, whether or not they had an affair with John Bennett, which kind of tracks a little bit because the guy was seducing women, and he had a family in another town that he abandoned. And then there's Joseph Smith, who is getting sealed to other people and all this. So it's like, there's a lot of truth or not truth in all of that. So kind of a wacky story. Anyway, we get a discourse some days later where Joseph explains that the kingdom of God preceded Jesus Christ coming to earth, which would explain why John the Baptist could do what he did by baptizing people before Jesus showed up and got baptized by him in the River Jordan. And then Moses and the previous prophets, they held priesthood keys. They had the oracles. And they always, these things kind of being in a dispensation constitute what's called the kingdom of God on the earth. So it's kind of an interesting teaching of the Latter-day Saints. We are very much, there's really no debate if there was any kingdom of God before Christ for us as Latter-day Saints. So we get a ton of land transactions. We get documents from or to Joseph Smith as the mayor of Nauvoo. And then we get section 129, as we currently enjoy it. So the earliest copy is Joseph Smith's journal in 1842-1844. This is the handwriting of Willard Richards. It has kind of an interesting blue paper, don't you think? Lined, about 4 pages long. And they're kind of small pages, but 4 pages long. We get the same thing reported by William Clayton in his journal. We get a copy in the history draft, as they call it, which was scribed by Willard Richards and Thomas Bullock. We get a copy in the manuscript history, which is volume 5. So I actually pulled this down just to remind us all. This is my sort of non-expensive paperback copy that I got years ago, but this is volume 5. This is where we are, and I think you will enjoy why I brought that out in the future. Anyway, so let's get into the introduction. So the earliest copy states that they were actually at the Masonic Hall where they were, and it says this: Thursday, February 9, 1843. Was at the Masonic Hall sometime in the forenoon, conversing with Mr. Remick and trying to effect a settlement. Remick promised to let Joseph have some notes on a paper maker in Louisville to pay him, and then went off contrary to promise. Conversation with Master Nye and William W. Phelps, went to Keokuk, read many letters. One from Judge Richard M. Young gave a relation from the mob in Hiram, which was written for the history. Parley Pratt and others came in, and Joseph explained the following. So they're just kind of dealing with a bunch of issues, and Parley Pratt comes in, and Joseph kind of pauses, and they get this sort of revelation here, or this section of the Doctrine and Covenants. The Clayton copy says, President Joseph related some of his history and gave us a key whereby we might know whether any administration was from God. History draft gives, spent most of the day in conversation with Parley P. Pratt and others. And then here it goes. The same thing goes for the manuscript history. However, a large part of the text is struck out from the history draft, which is kept in the manuscript history. It talks about David Patton and so forth, but these were included in the version I will read. So we will read the whole thing, and you will see sort of the difference there. Then we get then he goes on in the history draft and says, a man came to me in Kirtland and told me he had seen an angel and described his dress. I told him he had seen no angel and that there was no such dress. Grew mad and went out into the streets and commanded fire to come down out of heaven to consume me. I laughed at him. An old liar he was. He said, you are one of Baal's prophets. Your God does not hear you. Jump up and cut yourself. And he commanded fire from heaven to consume my house. Now, probably not the most mature response to things, but anyway, yeah, that was some of the stuff that Joseph Smith deals with. Anyway, there is no difference in modern section headings for this. So the historical introduction from the Joseph Smith papers about section 129 is, Joseph Smith apparently gave the remarks during a casual conversation with apostles Orson Pratt and Parley P. Pratt and others who had called on him in the afternoon. Though they were not delivered as a formal discourse, his teachings were significant enough that William Clayton and Willard Richards, who were both present on this occasion, wrote them down. Prefacing his remarks, Joseph Smith related some of his history, and then instructed those in attendance how they might know whether any administration was from God. So this kind of thing has been given before. I've spoken about it in a previous episode. However, Parley was away on his mission when all of this happened. And so this is the one that gets shared and canonized. But basically, Joseph had talked about this a couple of times. We've already discussed this in a previous episode. And so he's kind of saying it for the benefit of those who didn't, and they recorded it better. So now it's canonized. Now, there was some debate at the time on angels or heavenly beings during this time. So historical introduction again. Theologians also debated the substance and materiality of angels. 18th century Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, very Swedish name, suggested that angels were corporeal beings who had lived on the earth and could converse with men face to face, while those who believed angels were translated or risen beings seemingly believed that all angels were corporeal beings. Some concluded that angels have no corporeal forms. Theologian Charles Buck explained that, quote, as to the nature of these beings, we are told that they are spirits, with the more general opinion being that they were substances, entirely spiritual, unquote. At the same time, Buck allowed that they can at any time assume bodies and appear in human shape. I would say that's kind of the popular culture version of supernatural beings or heavenly beings, if you will, is that they're spirits, and if they want to go into a body, they can. You see that in horror movies. Anyway, whatever. Further in, we get Joseph Smith suggested a new idea, which classified heavenly messengers as either resurrected corporeal beings or disembodied spirits awaiting resurrection. Joseph Smith used this occasion in February 1843 to refine that explanation by distinguishing between resurrected personages and the spirits of just men made perfect, who were still awaiting resurrection. Now, for the content and footnotes of this, because this version differs from what we have in Scripture today, I will read the whole thing. So the journal shares this. There are 3 administrator angels, spirits, devils, 1 class in heaven, angels, the spirits of just men made perfect, innumerable company of angels and spirits of just men made perfect. An angel appears to you How will you prove him? Ask him to shake hands. If he has flesh and bones, he is an angel. Spirit hath not flesh and bones. Spirit of a just man made perfect. Person in its tabernacle could hide its glory, which I find interesting. A person in its tabernacle can hide their glory, which implies that there might be angels amongst us. They're just hiding their glory. Interesting. Footnote 4 to this says, Luke 24 describes an instance in which the resurrected Jesus appeared to two disciples whose eyes were holden that they should not know him. Hebrews 13 similarly mentions some who have entertained angels unawares. So apparently that's because if you have a body, you can either show or not show your glory. So let's continue on. If David W. Patton or the devil came, how would you determine, should you take hold of his hand, you would not feel it. If it were a false administration, he would not do it. True spirit will not give his hand, the devil will. 3 keys. Okay, footnote 5 to this. Patton was an apostle killed during the conflict between Latter-day Saints and their neighbors in Missouri in 1838. While delivering a discourse about baptisms for the dead on the 5th of October, 1840, Joseph Smith related and corrected aspects of a vision received by English church member Anne Booth, in which she saw Patton administer the gospel to John Wesley, the 18th century founder of the Methodist movement. So Anne Booth apparently said that she saw David Patton sharing the gospel with the person who came up with the Methodist movement. Kind of cool. And also may or may not have been true. We don't know. Anyway, so there we go. Now, that's it. So there's these 3 grand keys, and the idea is that if the spirit passes through your hand, that's a bad spirit. If the spirit said, sorry, I don't have a body, I can't touch you, that's a good spirit, like David W. Patton, for example, in this example. Or if they have like flesh and bones and they can shake your hand, that means they're an angel that's been resurrected. And apparently they can hide their glory. So a very interesting little thing. So that's section 132. Very different than what we have today. But I wanted to read the original copy that we have. Anyway, we get a lot more deeds and land sales. We get another oath of office for the mayor of Nauvoo by Joseph Smith for the first time because of the resignation of John C. Bennett as the mayor. The second time Joseph ran unopposed. So here he is doing another oath of office for winning the election. So basically, John C. Bennett had to leave for personal reasons, as he said, because he got busted. And then, Joseph Smith takes over as the mayor of Nauvoo, and this is that oath of office. We get a few other things, and then we get a poem to William W. Phelps, which bears Joseph's name, but it is very unknown how much he actually had to do with creating this poem. I would read it to you, but it is 78 verses long. Yikes. It was published in the Times and Seasons. The historical introduction for this poem says this. A Times and Seasons editorial introducing the poem implied that Joseph Smith composed the poem in response to a remark by his lawyer, Justin Butterfield, during his closing arguments that Joseph Smith's recent habeas corpus hearing in Springfield, Illinois. Butterfield claimed that Joseph Smith was an innocent and unoffending man, and that the only difference between him and biblical prophets was that the, quote, old prophets prophesied in poetry and the modern in prose, unquote. Favorably comparing Joseph Smith's poem to biblical literature, the editor of the Times and Seasons expressed hope that Butterfield would be convinced that the modern prophets can prophesy in poetry, as well as the ancient prophets, and that no difference, even of that kind, any longer exists, unquote. The poem was also a response to a poem Joseph Smith received from William W. Phelps, one of his scribes, on the 20th of January, 1843. Phelps's poem, which invited Joseph Smith to join him in contemplating a post-mortal heavenly state, was published in the Times and Seasons above Joseph Smith's response. So basically, this is saying, we don't do it in poetry? Okay, let's do it in poetry. And it's a long poem, so you want to go read it? You go right ahead. It's in the josephsmithpapers.org, waiting for you. If you can put it to music, I will give you mad respect. Anyway, We get many more documents, and then we get the minutes of a meeting where two men were literally fist fighting over islands that they thought they owned in the Mississippi River that they'll stake their claim to. Joseph attended and disapproved of how things were being dealt with to this point and encouraged these men to sort this matter out in a better way. So there he is acting as a mayor. We get a few other important matters like power of attorney to amass a liman for properties in Indiana, discourses on the payment of taxes with actual coin or metal specie rather than banknotes because those were failing so much, and Joseph writing an official passing of the baton to John Taylor as the new editor of the Times and Seasons. And ladies and gentlemen, thus ends volume number 11 of the document series. Boom. And that will be our first part. In our next, we're going to be talking about Porter Rockwell getting arrested and a little bit of arms dealing going on in Nauvoo. So stay tuned.